This presentation is a reflection on the move from autonomy to Eigentlichkeit, or so-called translated authenticity, or obviously better is ownmost, but people are fixated on authenticity, which is the title of the Adorno's book, lambasting the concept. So we have in Kant freedom, and freedom is associated with the human thinking, in the sense that something that we think and we see that it's absolutely correct. So Kant says never to lie is the absolutely correct rule that anyone can understand. And then one can further understand that to distinguish between, to ask the question, isn't it that it's prudent in certain situations to lie? And then yes, it is. But we're not talking about prudence. We're talking about the point about it being prudent to lie in certain situations is sort of like, oh, it's an expedient. It's something that brings us below the level of not lying, which is the actual rule of reason. And Kant's claim is reason, while being real, is not something alien, but rather in the essence of the human being. So that anything other than following this kind, so it's almost like there's a box inside of a human being, and there's a certain kind of not rather than an eye, there's something else, and we don't know what it is, but it's as though we're seeing the result of a certain type of reasoning that says not to lie is true, and we can juxtapose that against all these empirical cases that make it that alienate it by making it attractive to lie because it's more prudent, or it's wiser to do so, or for some qualified reason. But that we could say, according to Kant, the categorical imperative tells us that we must rule as a law of nature, that this is one isn't to lie, is to when we're free and broken free from any other motive, such as pragmatic motives or mercenary motives. Some getting paid for not lying in some way, as it were, through what would happen. So it's sort of I guess we should what is sort of valuable to compare the way Kant thinks about that as on analogy with the sort of sense data, like the Aristotle's simply gazing upon the ideas, Aristotle or Plato. But nonetheless, it has a pragmatic meaning. The pure moral injunction, in some way, it's a guide to our action. But what Kant says is it's a special kind that's unlike any other kind, in that every other kind it pays in some way, whereas these kind, but actually that's the funny thing. He actually said this kind pays also, but its only payment is that you're obeying your innermost essence as a reasoning being. That's his claim. Whereas, so here's the formal thing. Kant says, and he's convicted, as it were, out of his own rascally mouth by people who come later. A Simmel, who is a very acute and trenchant critic of Kant, but a critic of Kant when it's not that when Nietzsche has already broken him down, but Simmel does it more neatly and more, as it were, more logically. And he points out that das Sollen, or the ought, which is the thing that reason adduces to itself as its free rule, is no different in status than sein, or being, which Kant has said is not a real predicate. Kant says sein, or being is a logical predicate. He says not a real predicate. But he claims that autonomy links to something in reality, but it's some kind of superfine reality behind the things, as it were, dusting on sich. And it's as though we had some kind of something like a sense organ, but that it could see it. But it's a mystery exactly how we're able to do it. But we are able to reason and see the point of Kant's arguments with regard to the categorical imperative in inducing rules like thou shalt not lie, but not from taking the word of revelation or prophecy, but supposedly by reason alone. So I think one interesting way to move from autonomy, which then Heidegger presents as Eigentlichkeit, so that so we should remember, this is very confusing. It's like, it's not inside outside, it's more, there's things that are alien to our essence and things that aren't alien to our essence. Gravity too, we could understand as coming from within us. Like all forces we could understand. I mean, if I move my arm, this is gravity's in play, and I'm willing it. So we will things that have to do with gravity. It's not a question of gravity versus something else. It's more like a question of, there's an order of our causation, where like there's courage, there's soprasini, or keeping even-headed, or something, calm mind. There's good sense, or phronimos. And then there's something higher, like something like the leader intelligence, as it's called in the nomai. But here, Kant develops it as the categorical imperative. But supposedly this ascending scale is leading more and more towards the things that are sort of like home is where one first starts out. So it's like the things that are more like where human beings are most at home rather than alienated. So the categorical imperative is supposed to bring human beings into the perfect home where there's no fremde or somehow alien force. So one could see within this realm of asking what's alien or not alien, then you could keep everything else in the this idea of ascendancy into the essence of the human being. But then you could ask, instead of the categorical imperative, isn't it more like there could be something like Habermas's, people have a discussion, and then is it a fair discussion, and are they reaching this so-called, like Habermas, Judith Butler, somebody like that, then it's the question, are they reaching a fair settlement on what the norms of behavior are to be, instead of in the place of where the categorical imperative is claiming to yield in a clear way the universal laws that we should follow if we're to be as rational beings most at home rather than most alienated. So the real distinction, it's often said like external, internal, but I think it makes more sense to put it in terms of alien or heimat, or at home, homedness, as it were. So then one passes through the freedom essay and one passes through various steps, but what I want to develop is how directly Eigentlichkeit or ownmostness or authenticity is Heidegger's special modified version of autonomy. And one way to see that is in Heidegger. So say we allow that Kant would be forced to follow what Simmel said and then demote Das Sollen, or the principle of autonomy, from that there is this thing of the odd and that it goes along with sort of the most perfect ethical behavior. Then one could say this Das Sollen, what is its status in reality? Is it like a tree? Is it like something one comes upon with the senses? And Kant can't he can't demonstrate that, and it's sort of and he just basically what he does is he prepares the way for saying there's a whole field of happenings here where the dialectic can happen. And then, before universal acceptance in anthropology, before there even was anthropology in the current sense, because anthropology used to mean basically psychology, before those fields got separated out into what they are now, ethnology, anthropology. And the general confusion about what's now called mostly norms came in, which everybody's abundantly familiar with, but it wasn't. The point is, all this wasn't decided at Kant's time. He was still saying there's one set of principles. Only he wasn't saying it in the sense of somebody who says, "Oh, I believe in the Ten Commandments" or something. He was saying it more. He was saying, because people like that, in Israel, for instance, they give lip service to the study of Torah and to the Haredi and the more orthodox, but they say that's not. They're not going to decide what the law of the land is. So, but Kant was talking about this is going to be not the law of the land in the sense of the public law, but when people were trained in something like what would be in England public school, Eden or something like that, and the equivalent in Prussia, it's like anyone who has any self-respect is going to accept this teaching and understand it, because they'll accept it because they'll think through it and they'll understand it and then they'll accept it. But then the problem was, it turned out there was some points in Kant's argument that it just showed this opening where Strauss says Kant raised his head at the gate of historicism, but he didn't enter. Because basically Kant's sort of, the way I'm looking at it now is, Hobbes introduced this claim that death is something outside of the state. In other words, the state, we make a social contract on the notion that the state is going to protect her life. If it can't do that, then we have the right to, according to Hobbes, to fight with the state and get away, as it were. To vote with our teeth or whatever, our nails in our teeth. I was just thinking of the notion of voting with your feet or whatever. But Kant is still saying, and it seems a contradiction, that ultimately the state has the right to put people to death if they're murderers and so on. So that's sort of like Judge Smales in Caddyshack or something like that, who says, "Oh, we're putting you to death for your own good." People think that doesn't make any sense, right? How could that be the law of their own freedom, to allow themselves to be put to death? I think that's the first step in Hobbes, in saying the state can't go that far as to tell you that we're putting you to death for your own good. In this way, I see in Kant, it's a kind of reactionary move in a way. Of course, everybody knows it's Kant is stimulated by Rousseau and by Hume, but Rousseau himself is already a kind of reactionary against Hobbes, but in a stranger way, with the formula of you will simply be forced to be free. I guess the extreme form of that is like you'll simply be forced to be put to death when you deserve to be put to death according to reason. So one could see there's a lot of problems here, and then let's start out by saying, that's where Heidegger starts by saying, instead of the categorical imperative as sort of the supreme last word, as it were, or the most recent word, or the most primary word of logic or reason, he's saying ultimately logic is language, speaking, talking, asking what's going on, and it goes in this direction, which, Habermas was a student of Heidegger. It goes in that direction of, in some way, of rational, fair discussion theory. Once logic gets clarified as, here's the thing where people are having a discussion and deciding what makes sense. In this sense, Heidegger, by saying language tells us what is offering a different picture of our essence than Kant, when Kant says the categorical imperative is the only part of language which can really tell us about our core of our essence. Heidegger saying language on the whole tells us what is, or I suppose I should say tells us what we are by telling us what everything is. So that Eigentlichkeit, that means the methodos or the path has to be within the language that we in some way could understand. And still it persists, I think, very strongly today, is all philosophizing, all academic work is done in a way that we sort of assume something like that the current language we're using more or less tells us what is. Rather than that, it tells us what is as an American or as whenever there's a discussion like that, it's always given sort of as an aside, it's always as though the lip service were being given to polyphony. This lip service were being given to polytropy, but it's assumed that it's acted as though what's ever being said is said in a universal and clear way. So propositions are still being presented, arguments are still being presented as though the argument of that there's on one side something that could see and understand things said and some object of them, and all kinds of accounts like this are being given as though they had a possibility of being the final account that would say the truth about it. In a way, all this is what Agamben's calling sharpening knives when nothing is left to be cut. Why is nothing left to be cut? Because where autonomy could say something, instead we have where autonomy could say something to the rational being. Instead we have Dasein, where Dasein is cultural, temporal, etc., where it's not, where it only in a certain way speaks to itself in a limited way that it knows that it's speaking to itself in a limited way.